Hi, this is Marla. Thanks so much for joining me today. My card was inspired by the Simon Says Stamp Monday Challenge, which was to put your mark on it. And I tend to lean towards flowers lately, and I thought that I would create another floral card this time because the Monday Challenge typically has a vintage vibe to it. I added that vintage vibe to my card. I want to do some water splattering on my background. We are going to do some embossing folder magic. I will link a video that I created just a few weeks ago using a 3D embossing folder and some of the techniques that I recommended that you might try with your 3D embossing folders. This is a play on that, and so I'm going to do some background stamping. I wanted to add water splatters, so I started with antique linen on white cardstock, and then I have this newspaper background stamp from Rubbernecker. I'm adding the ground espresso to the back of the stamp, and then you see that I do curve my stamp. I'm only partially stamping it, and I curve it to make sure that I don't get any harsh edges. Here's a recommendation: if you want your pattern to go in a different direction, you can turn the stencil over. There is no right or wrong way to use a stencil. Both sides work beautifully, so I did turn it over so that the direction of these flourishes would be the way that I wanted them. I added gathered twigs to the stencil, and I'm using that same color around the outside edge of this panel. It's going to help draw your eye in a little bit, and I really like the adding that dark color to the outside edge. Even when I'm using vibrant colors, just adding a little bit of ink to the outside just helps draw your eye in. This is a step you could skip, but I wanted to smooth out the transition between the antique linen and the gathered twigs, so I just added a little bit more around the edges. And then, of course, as I mentioned, I'm going to sprinkle this with water. My favorite way to do it is clapping. I think I get a really nice coverage that way. I'll let it sit for just a few moments. You can add your paper towel or microfiber cloth over the top to lift up the ink. It's not always necessary, but I did it for this card, and then I dried the panel. I'm going to show you two sides where I die cut it, but I actually did all four. I cut an 1/8 inch off of all four sides, which left me with a 4 by 5 1/4 inch panel. Here's the magic with the 3D embossing folder. This one is from Anna Griffin. It's called Heart Harlequin. It's now retired. I will center that panel into the embossing folder and then use the appropriate sandwich to run it through my die cutting machine. In my last embossing folder video, I shared again using watercolor, so I have gold watercolor that I'm adding over the raised edges. I was a little bit impatient here, so I didn't mix the water into the paint as well as I should have, and when I went to put my finger in, it was a little bit too wet. So for the first two areas, I'm using a brush. This isn't my preferred method. As soon as it thickens up a little bit and that water absorbs into the watercolor, I go back to my favorite method, which is my finger. So I'm just going over some of the raised areas. I'm not using the watercolor in the center because my flowers are going to be covering that up. So I just added that bit of watercolor to the outside edge, and then I spritzed it again with water. I'll use my heat tool, and then because I did cut that panel down, I need to add just a very thin border around the edges to cover up the white, and I'm using ground espresso for that. So I have 2 tones of brown on the outer edge, and then I have that really bright antique linen on the center, and then you can see the beautiful embossing. So when I show you the close-ups of this card, you're going to be able to see all of the beautiful texture. I added a heavy hand of that ground espresso on the corners as well. From Papertrey Ink, I have die cut the Gardenia die using vanilla cardstock, and I'm going to stick with that vintage vibe using some colors that are more complementary to the browns. So for the greens, I'm using the crushed olive as my base color, and then I'll add a little bit of dimension to the outer edges using forest moss, switching between my two brushes because I am going to blend this out a little bit more, coming back in with that crushed olive. So it gives it, you can see that it really does give it a little bit of dimension by adding a second color to the outside edges and to the bottom half. I could have used a smaller brush, but this one worked just fine. And then for the centers of these flowers, I am going to use fossilized amber. Again, the fossilized amber, unlike the squeezed lemonade, has more of a brown undertone to it, which is going to complement the vintage feel of the card. If I would have went with squeezed lemonade, it would have been way too vibrant. So I add that ink to the center, and we're going to start building our first flower. There are two flowers that cut out that you can assemble. For several of the pieces, I want that dimension. I love dimension on my cards and in my flowers. So I'm going to align this top petal with the bottom base layer, adding that piece of foam tape. For my second layer, I will add additional foam tape to that. And it's kind of like a little bow tie piece, but it has a very thin center. So I'm using this scrapbook.com 1/8 inch foam tape, and I'm adding it to the left and the right side because if I added it straight across, it would show underneath that center area. So this aligns with two other petals, and then there's a couple other pieces that I'm just going to glue directly down to the flower. So not adding any additional dimension. You certainly could. That 1/8 inch foam tape would fit behind this piece. And then we'll start working on flower number 2, again adding that foam tape to the back of this. I'm going to add it to all 3 petals. So first I'm going to add that fossilized amber to the center of the largest die piece. And here's where I'm going to add another piece of foam tape to the 2 other petals. I just didn't want them to get smashed if I decided to mail them. You would get that bend in the cardstock. So adding that foam tape to the other 2 petals just made sure that it was really stabilized and it wouldn't get damaged if I put it through the mail, which I'm not sure that I'm going to be, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. So I'll align this piece, and then I realize that there is one more piece to the first flower that we put together, and I'll just add this center to flower number 2 and go back to flower number 1 and add that final piece. You can see that adding that little bit of color to the center of the gardenia really does, along with the foam tape, help bring those flowers to life. If you went with just a straight shot of cardstock, I don't think that it adds the same beauty that adding a little bit of ink to the flower does. All right, so more dimension. These leaves do have an embossed line in it, so down the center, and then there's some lines on the left and the right side of the veins. I'm only going to use my stylus to add it to the center line, and then I use the ball of my stylus to get that curve in the leaves. Again, this is just adding a little bit more interest to the flower. Now I did end up being a little, this is a very small stylus that I used to get that line embossed, and so I did get a little bit of a hole on the first leaf because I was being a little bit too heavy-handed, but I was able to fix it or camouflage it. I added some ink to the back of the leaves so that as they lift up, when you look underneath, it'll have that green tone instead of the white. And now we are going to add just a little bit more interest to this card by using the Essential Arches dies from Spellbinders. I cut out the center of my panel, and I'm going to center it onto an A2 top folding card base. This is craft cardstock. I have the center of my arch that I'm going to use this Papertrey Ink brown twine. This is some of my favorite twine. It kind of has a little bit of a frayed edge to it. I'll use some tape that I had on my desk. So this is just a micro pour piece that I used when I was die cutting the arch, and then I'll use a small piece of purple tape that I had on my desk. So I just kind of place tape on the edges of my desk as I take it off my die cuts. And you could see that I wrapped it around 3 times, and then I'm adding foam tape to the back. You could do it the opposite way. You could add foam tape to the back of the panel and then inlay this, but because I'm adding the florals on top, I needed the foam tape on the arch so that it wasn't dipping. If I did the opposite, then I would have to add more foam tape to the back of my flowers to make sure that they sat nicely against my frame. But in this, by adding the foam tape to the arch, I don't have to do that. I'm trying to figure out where I want these leaves to go. So we have the cluster of 4. We have one leaf that's larger than the other one of the single leaves, and I finally figure out where I want everything to go. But first I need to add that bow, because I do like bows on my cards. So I'm going to use a little bit of this art glitter glue to attach my bow, and then we'll start gluing everything down. Now I do end up changing that leaf that's on the bottom. You can see it on the bottom gardenia. I end up moving it to the top one, so I have 2 coming out, but you can see that it will eventually be a visual triangle either way. There's a little bit of the leaf that's sticking out between the 2 flowers. That's in the upper left hand corner. I did off camera just kind of lift the leaves of that top gardenia, and then I went ahead and trimmed that off so that you didn't have that green poking out from between the 2 flowers. And here's where I'm going to make the change for that 3rd leaf. Once I finish with this, I do like to fluff the petals on my flowers, so I'll use my fingers very carefully to just kind of lift and bend them up. You could put little foam circles underneath it or foam squares underneath those petals to lift them even higher, but I find that just using my fingers to fluff them works well. And once I finish with this, I'll show you all the beautiful dimension that I was able to achieve on this card. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, I would absolutely love for you to subscribe and ring the bell so that you're notified of any videos that I do upload. I will link the Simon Says Stamp Challenge in the description box below. Thanks so much for joining me today, and until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day. Thanks for watching.